Okay, let's get started. My name is Luis Favela from University of Central Florida. The talk is neural reuse is a general mechanism, but neurodarwinism is a fundamental theory. So the primary claim that I'll be defending is that neural reuse is a general mechanism of brain organization, and that is a general mechanism that is subsumed by a more fundamental and general theory of neurodarwinism. So plan is just a quick little introduction, the current state of play as I see it in neuroscience, then an overview of neural reuse, followed by an overview of neurodarwinism, which I think a lot of people might not be too familiar with. And then I will discuss briefly the nature of fundamental theories, specifically how it relates to fundamental theories in neuroscience and what we would expect out of a fundamental theory in neuroscience. And then I'll be concluding. So, neuroscience, what's the current state of play? Essentially, there's a set of general successful approaches, as I view it. Of course, this is a real simplified version of what's happening in neuroscience. There's a lot of different kinds of neuroscience. There's molecular neuroscience, computational neuroscience. But if there's any sets of commitments or methods or approaches that seem to be general across various kinds of neuroscience, I would say that they are these three. So there is the approach of decomposition and localization. So taking apart the target phenomenon, trying to localize causally relevant features of the phenomenon. There's a mechanistic approach, which includes very much similar to decomposition and localization. So again, you want to take apart the system, you want to understand it from start to finish conditions. And then there's always the classic reductionism. So we want to find the basic constituents of the system, and we want to find where the system starts and when it ends. So again, very simple understanding of these kind of successful approaches in neuroscience. So I want to focus on mechanisms because I think that's the predominant view, especially in the philosophy of neuroscience, the predominant view of what is the successful approach by various neuroscientists. So what do we mean by mechanisms? Well, usually it means the search for mechanisms. So what are the mechanisms for X? What is the mechanism for visual perception? What is the mechanism for long-term potentiation and memory? All these different approaches, again, there are many different kinds of mechanism and mechanistic approaches, but I think there's a core set of features and approaches that are followed by people who proclaim to be utilizing a mechanistic approach. So the first step is identify the phenomenon, treat it as a system that is comprised of constituent parts, and those constituent parts contribute in various ways to that system. Second step is decompose that system into the parts that you think or you hypothesize are responsible for causing the phenomenon. And three, localize the operations to the components and order them in terms of start to finish sequence conditions. So the pros of this approach is that it's very informative, right? So it gives you like really good descriptions of the phenomenon. When you break it apart, both spatially and temporally, you can get a grasp of what's happening easier. It gives you explanations, right? So explanations in terms of how does visual perception work? How does memory work? And it gives you practical benefits as well. So the development of drugs, for instance, to help with neuropathologies, for instance. One con, and I considered putting cons in quotes because I don't know that this is necessarily a con in general, because this might not be a goal of people who are practicing mechanistic approaches, people in terms of neuroscientists, in terms of philosophers. But in terms of the current context of my discussion, I think this is a con. And the con is that the mechanistic approach is atheoretical, right? There's no theory built into it. There's no theory built into it any more than saying that a system can be taken apart and put back together, that it can be understood in terms of what its constituents contribute, it can be understood temporally from start to finish conditions, but other than that, it's pretty much theory-free. One potential problem with an atheoretical approach is that the successes of the approach end up leading to some of the problems, right? So a classic statement about neuroscience is that it's data-rich and theory-poor. So these different approaches, mechanistic approaches, reductionist approaches, they facilitate the ability to understand systems in great detail, especially computational approaches. And as technology increases and gets better and better, we're able to understand systems in ever more detail. So for example, an electron microscopy volume of an adult fruit fly takes up about 106 terabytes of data. That's huge, right? And fruit flies only have a little over 300 neurons. Now, it's speculated that a ultra-high resolution 3D model of a human brain would probably take up about 21,000 terabytes. So it's exponentially more complicated, exponentially more data to reckon with to understand the system. So these approaches are taking apart the system, right? The brain, the nervous system, and they're giving us more and more detail. But the problem is that we don't really have theory necessarily to interpret all that data. This is a problem that's been pointed out by neuroscientist Olaf Sporns, when he talks about that massive amounts of data and descriptions are not enough. And there's a few representative quotes of what he's getting at that are here. So Sporn says, all scales matter for the functioning of the system as a whole, and technology for integrating data across scales is urgently needed. So Sporns, who's a neuroscientist, he's a computational neuroscientist, understands that brains are not isolated from the world. They're not isolated from bodies. Mind is not isolated from being in a context, being in a situation. And so when you want to understand mental activity, you have to understand that various scales matter when you want to understand the function of the system. So various scales spatially, right? So are we looking at gross anatomical units of the brain? Are we looking at neural networks? Are we looking at single neurons? Are we looking at synaptic activity? We need to take all those things into consideration. We need to understand this activity at various temporal scales also. So milliseconds to seconds to hours to even weeks. Different types of mental activity occur at different temporal scales. So here's where a problem comes in with taking into consideration all these various scales. You end up getting more and more detail, more and more information about the system. So for example, in the previous slide, the ultra-high resolution 3D reconstruction of a brain might lead to about 21,000 terabytes. That's fine, right? Now we have a really detailed image, really detailed picture of what the brain looks like and what it's doing under various conditions. But as Sporns points out, the point of building brain models or computational reconstructions of brains is to advance understanding of brain function. But what ends up happening is that we end up creating in silico replicas that are complex and incomprehensible as the real thing. So we end up with more and more detail, but without a theoretical lens to interpret it, it's not going to lead to understanding. And this is in the last point where Sporn states that we are in urgent need for a theoretical foundation for understanding the brain. So we need a lens through which to understand all of this data. Without that lens, we'll be awash in all these details. So what are some contender brain theories, these grand unified theories of brain and cognitive function? Well, lately it's been a lot of focus on the Bayesian brain or predictive processing as a potential grand unified theory of the brain. Friston's free energy principle has been purported as a potential unifying theory of the brain. Today I want to talk about another potential option, which is neural reuse, which has been proposed as a potential grand unifying theory of the brain. So neural reuse is associated with Mike Anderson, who's a professor of philosophy of science at Western University in Ontario. And he states that neural reuse is a general theory of brain architecture. It's a general theory of brain architecture founded within a class of theories that focus on neuroplasticity. So the idea in general of neural reuse is that local brain regions are used for multiple tasks across multiple domains. So if we look at the figure, point A, the modularity understanding of brain architecture is that we have these informationally encapsulated modules that are domain-specific, such as visual perception or language. These would be different modules that are performing specific tasks, and these were selected for those tasks. So if you take a strong evolutionary psychology perspective, you might think that the modules that we have for various cognitive capacities now, in the year 2018, were originally selected for tens of thousands of years ago during the Pleistocene. Humans were running around in the savannah, and when they developed these different capacities stayed isolated from each other, and we still have some of those capacities now. Again, language, visual perception as being examples of those. Reuse, on the other hand, says that there are no domain-specific modules that are informationally encapsulated from other modules. What we have is different areas of the brain that are able to facilitate different functions. Right? So what matters is the pattern of activity in the brain. The pattern of activity based on what is available in the brain at any particular time, in a body, in a world, at any particular time and given a particular scenario. So one classic example of this is language. So Anderson discusses Broca's area as an excellent example of how this modular approach, this strictly modular approach to understanding cognitive function is not going to work. It's not supported by the empirical data. He discusses work by Nishitani and colleagues that showed that the area commonly associated with language, Broca's area, is also associated with various action activities, bodily control and movement. And so the idea that the Broca's area of the brain is just for language processing is not supported by the empirical data. And Anderson provides many, many, many different examples, and he's conducted many different analyses that show that just about every part of the brain is associated with a wide range of different activities. Thus, there is no brain area for X that is not malleable, that is not able to adapt, that's not able to acclimate and adapt to different situations. And this is how different types of cognitive capacities arise, via the available neural resources in a body and in a world. Anderson argues that there are a number of implications for this view of brain architecture. So one is that new capacities, be it language, visual perception, hand-eye coordination, different types of activities, group social behaviors, that these capacities are supported by mixing different available neural elements. Two, another implication of this approach is that given that the brain is plastic and that these abilities are also adaptable, there are biological and behavioral implications for understanding these capacities in terms of reuse. Three, higher-order cognitive capacities do not have their own unique and specific neural architecture, but instead are built from existing neural structures. So although in the Pleistocene, humans might not have been, probably were not actually, doing any calculus or other sorts of advanced mathematics, though we are able now to do calculus, well, some of us are, but we're able to do things now with pre-existing neural architecture that maybe we weren't originally selected for doing. And so the idea in general is that neural reuse is supposed to be a general theory of brain structure, brain function, that really hinges on the idea of strong neuroplasticity and a plasticity that utilizes resources, both neural, bodily, and environmental, to give rise to and underlie various cognitive capacities. So the question is neural reuse the fundamental theory of brain structure and function? Is it a general theory of brain structure and function? Can it do that work? Well, as I'll argue shortly, I think neural reuse is a potential mechanism, or actually a likely mechanism, of brain architecture. I think it is empirically supported, but it's not fundamental. There is another fundamental theory of brain structure and function that subsumes or that encompasses neural reuse. So that theory, the more fundamental theory of brain structure and function, is Neurodarwinism. Neurodarwinism was developed by Gerald Edelman, Nobel Prize winner for his work in immunology. And Neurodarwinism, which is also known as the theory of neuronal group selection, is, like neural reuse, a theory of brain structure and function. Edelman calls it Neurodarwinism because he focuses on the aspect of Darwinism known as population thinking, or selectionism. And so the idea is that one of the primary drivers of evolution is variance in populations. Now, populations can apply at the very small scale. So Edelman won the Nobel Prize for his work on immunology and the immune system and how those cells exhibit population dynamics. Populations can apply to neural groups, so populations of neurons, and that's the focus of Neurodarwinism. Populations can also apply to populations of organisms, so bird flocking or various things of the sort. And so from this general Darwinian approach, this selectionist approach, Neurodarwinism follows three principles. So one, brain structure and function begins with developmental selection. So this developmental selection leads to primary repertoire. I'll explain each of these in more detail shortly. The second primary principle is experiential selection yields the secondary repertoire. And the third primary component of Neurodarwinism is reentry. And so these three taken together are what lead to the development of nervous system structure and function and cognitive capacities. So the first stage, or first step in Neurodarwinism, is developmental selection leads to primary repertoire. What this captures is the very earliest developmental stages of an organism. This is supposed to account for the morphology of an organism. This step in the process is tied most strongly to genetic expression. It also includes selectionism at the molecular scale. So the development of an organism doesn't just occur at the genetic level, but also at the level of molecular selection, even smaller than the genetic level. So selectionism is acting on cell adhesion molecules, or CAM cells, and substrate adhesion molecules. So at this very early stage of development, for example, in human embryology stage, or embryo stage, you find the expression of morphology of the system. And it's strongly genetically driven, but there are still selectionist pressures occurring. The second is that, well, that should say the secondary repertoire. The secondary repertoire is still slightly tied to genetic expression, but it's more now tied to phenotypic development. This requires influence from the environment, from the experience that the organism has. So for example, Edelman says that experiential selection begins in the womb. So the temperature, gravity, all of these things are affecting the genetic expression. So we already find that in this case, the environmental pressures are starting to take a more primary role in the development of an organism. But this is always still tied to the basic genetic code of the system. In terms of the nervous system, what we find at this stage, again, the secondary repertoire, is that now where we had synaptic systems starting to develop, where we have neural networks starting to develop, neurons sprouting out in the brain, now we're starting to find that expression or experience, that is, in the world is now strengthening various neural networks. And so we start seeing neuroplasticity, we start seeing Hebbian learning occurring. And so with this simple example on the bottom, say you have various neurons involved in the perception of different fruits. You might have some activity or inactivity of different neurons as you're perceiving apples and bananas. Over time, you might find yourself looking at less apples and looking at more bananas. You find yourself never eating any apples, always eating bananas. And so the neural networks associated with bananas become strengthened. And the neural networks associated with apples become weaker. And this leads to the third part of neurodarwinism, which is reentry. Now, reentry is a process where an organism's cognitive behavioral capacities, right? So these capacities that result from, again, the original primary repertoire, which is the original development, morphology based on genetic expression, followed by the secondary repertoire, which is the experience that is now strengthening or weakening various aspects of that expression. When these cognitive behavioral capacities are supported by anatomically distinct maps in the brain. So we have different cognitive abilities, different behavioral abilities that arise based on experience, conditioning, and strengthening various parts of the brains and communicating via these reciprocal signals. So these signals allow for a sort of coordination among different neural populations. And these neural populations are what facilitate the ability to have different cognitive behavioral capacities. And this is tied to the state of the body and the state of the world. So again, this is a very embodied approach as well. A key part about reentry is the notion of degeneracy. And so degeneracy is the idea that structurally different neuronal circuits and maps can give rise to the same function. So taken together, the expression of the genes along with the experience of the world, followed by the different strengthening and weakening of signals across different neuronal populations in the mind, these can occur such that the same part of the brain can give rise to different functions. So as we see in the image below, if there was neural redundancy, that would be like the same capacity underlaid by different neuronal populations. Degeneracy says that the same capacity could be underlaid by different neuronal populations. Degeneracy also includes pluripotency, which is the idea that different populations can give rise to the same capacity. So this is a very much neuroplasticity approach to understanding brain networks and functions. And it's one that, again, is not tied to this strictly modular approach, this kind of classic informationally encapsulated modular approach. Again, the kind of module approach that characteristically is purported by evolutionary psychologists, for example. One example of reentry signaling that has empirical support is the thalamocortical system. And what we have in the thalamocortical system is connections throughout the brain that run through the system. And via this pathway, we find that various parts of the brain can be incorporated and utilized and appealed to to underlie different kinds of cognitive behavioral activities. So that's one example of reentry in the brain. So to sum up what's going on with Neurodarwinism, the developmental stage occurs when you have basic cell expression that's more strongly tied to genetics. And so we have cells that are dividing and dying. And these are, in terms of the brain, where you start seeing the sprouting, basic sprouting development of neurons and neural connections. As the system starts experiencing things, it can both be internally within the brain itself, it could be in the body, it could be in the world. As those experiences occur over time, those signals that originally sprouted in the developmental stage start to strengthen. And various cognitive capacities are strengthened or weakened, developing on the experience of a particular organism, the neurons in a brain, in a body, in the world. And the way that these capacities arise is via reentrant signaling, such that neuronal groups can communicate across the brain in anatomically distant portions of the brain and give rise to various cognitive capacities via this reciprocal signaling. What's the supporting evidence for Neurodarwinism? Well, there's a decent amount. There's studies on binocular rivalry, other visual perception phenomena that have been studied and that have been provided as support for the idea of neuronal group selection. The principles of Neurodarwinism have been applied to brain-based robots. Neurodarwinism is most known for being one of the steps towards general theory of consciousness that Edelman and colleagues have been defending for many years. It applies to the immune system, neural network connectivity, etc. So there's a decent amount of empirical support for the idea of the theory of neuronal group selection, of Neurodarwinism. And so this brings us now to fundamental theories. So what would a fundamental theory in neuroscience look like? What should a theory do? Well, I'm not going to be able to give you an uncontroversial definition of what a theory is or what a theory has to be like. This is something that's way beyond the scope of what I can do here, or maybe what I could ever do. But let's just limit it to what should a fundamental theory in neuroscience do? What's a sketch of a fundamental theory? Well, there's a few basic features of a fundamental theory in neuroscience. One is that it should explain the structure and function of the brain anatomically. It should be able to explain the structure and function of cognitive capacities. The theory should be plausible, and by plausible, I mean what Newell meant by plausible, or plausible aspects of the theory, which is that it's basically consistent with other commitments, other theoretical commitments. Third, the fundamental theory should generate hypotheses, and it should generate predictions for those hypotheses. And as a fundamental theory, I think that fundamental theory of neuroscience should underlie other theories. So there could be other theories that fall within or under its umbrella. So how does neural reuse and Neurodarwinism stack up against each other in terms of these four different features of fundamental theories in neuroscience? Let's look at each in turn. So the first one, do they explain the structure and function of the brain? Do they explain different cognitive capacities and how they arise? Neural reuse, yes, it does. How? Well, it gives explanations of a wide range of cognitive phenomena, synesthesia being one of them. That's an example that Anderson gives. And how does it do it? Well, it explains these things via mechanisms of reuse, right? The reuse of neural populations. Neurodarwinism also provides explanations of structure and function. It does this from the level of development up through engagement with the world, and does this via principles of selectionism, so very general Darwinian principles. Second, plausibility. Is neural reuse plausible? Is it consistent with other commitments? I think the answer is yes. It's consistent with an embodied approach to cognition. It's consistent with the network neuroscience understanding of the brain. Anderson makes a very compelling case for that. But neurodarwinism also is consistent with an embodied approach to cognition and a network neuroscience understanding of the brain. Third, does neural reuse provide hypotheses and predictions? Yes. Anderson provides a number of examples. One hypothesis is that there should be functional differences via patterns of activity and not necessarily localized anatomical areas of the brain. Does neurodarwinism provide hypotheses and predictions? Yes, it provides hypotheses about the nature of visual perception and the underlying neural architecture. It also provides hypotheses about network architectures in general in the brain. Some recent work has shown consistencies between neurodarwinism and small world networks, for example, and this was a prediction that was made by earlier proponents of neurodarwinism. And the last one, does neural reuse underlie other theories? So the answer is yes, but it does not underlie neurodarwinism. Does neurodarwinism underlie other theories? The answer is yes. It underlies other theories such as neural reuse. So the idea is that neural reuse meets many of the features, or if not all of the features, of a general theory. But it could also serve as a fundamental theory. It doesn't end up serving as a fundamental theory, though, because there's a more fundamental theory. Neurodarwinism is the more fundamental theory. So everything that neural reuse explains can fall under the heading of neurodarwinism as an example, as a mechanism, as a process, as an expression of neurodarwinism. But the same doesn't hold true the other way. Neural reuse is exhibiting features of neurodarwinism, but neurodarwinism is not necessarily explained by all the features of neural reuse in the way that neurodarwinism can explain the features of neural reuse. And so why is neural reuse subsumed by neurodarwinism? Well, I think neural reuse is a descriptive account of the architecture and plasticity in the brain. I think it describes to us in a very useful and empirically supported way why the brain has the architecture that it does, or that is how it has the architecture that it does, and it explains this in terms of plasticity. Neurodarwin, on the other hand, is not just explaining in terms of describing what's happening, right? It doesn't just explain how the brain has the architecture that it does, but why it has the architecture and the plasticity that it does. Starting with the primary repertoire, we can understand why does an organism have the architecture that it does at that stage of development. Well, it's based on selectionist principles acting the genetic level and the molecular level. At the secondary repertoire scale, so a little bit after early development in an organism, neurodarwinism can explain why a system has the architecture that it does and the capacities that it does. That's because selectionism is acting on the system through various experiences that the system is having. And reentry provides an account of why those systems have the architecture that they do. And it does this in terms of coordination among neural populations, coordination among the brain, body, and world. And this coordination is able to adapt via degeneracy. So degeneracy is a type of plasticity. And so degeneracy is fundamentally a selectionist approach as well to understanding the architecture of the brain. I do not want to say that neural reuse is wrong or that neural reuse is an incorrect approach to understanding various features of the brain. I think reuse is a very sophisticated and it's clearly an empirically supported account of some aspects of the brain. I would say that it actually isn't a very nice account of some aspects of degeneracy in the brain. But I don't think that it gives a strong account of as much of what neurodarwinism can give an account of. Anderson does argue that neural reuse can be applied to the developmental stages of organisms. I'm not quite convinced by that yet, but I also think that it can also play a role in actually bolstering neurodarwinism. So neural reuse is a nice way of expanding and supporting various aspects of neurodarwinism. But neural reuse is not the basic or the most fundamental theory. Neurodarwinism provides the more fundamental theory of brain structure and function. And so, in conclusion, I think a theory has strengths in terms of its ability to be broadly applicable, to unify wide-ranging evidence and concepts. Darwinism, in general, provides a very nice fundamental theory for a wide range of natural phenomena, obviously in biology, in psychology. Here in neuroscience, one way is via neurodarwinism. So neurodarwinism is itself subsumed under the broader fundamental biological theory of Darwinism. Neural reuse itself is subsumed within neurodarwinism, where neurodarwinism is the more general theory of the brain and of cognition. And so Darwinism, again, provides the overarching theory, of which neurodarwinism is a form of it, and neural reuse is a form or aspect of various parts of neurodarwinism. So again, neural reuse provides descriptions, empirically supported accounts of the architecture of the brain, but it is not a fundamental theory in the way that neurodarwinism is a fundamental theory of the brain. And so a bunch of references, and I welcome questions. Feel free to email me, and yeah, thank you for your time.